This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Joining me from Israel today is Dr. Sara Yael Hirschhorn. I invited Dr. Hirschhorn to join me in this conversation today because I was looking for an academic voice to really give us perspective on what's going on in Israel at this point in time as the conflict, in a sense, drags on. Dr. Hirschhorn is a historian of Israel and Jewish culture. She's visiting professor at the University of Haifa. She's a fellow at the Jewish Policy Institute, and she's written a book which is called City on a Hilltop, published by Howard University Press. Dr. Hirschhorn, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
If I may then, Professor, I want to begin by asking you, a lot of people today, now that the war has dragged on in Gaza for some time, they're conflicted. You know, all these protests have happened around the world. A lot of people, including in India and many other parts of the world, feel conflicted on how they should be feeling about this war, on where they ought to stand. Obviously, there's a lot of noise about the Palestinian cause and, you know, how the Palestinians are suffering in Gaza. But the voices that we saw rise in unison, and rightfully so, after the October 7th massacre in Israel, they seem to be getting drowned in all this clamor. And we are not hearing enough about what's really happening on the ground in Israel and what Israelis living in Israel are feeling, thinking, observing, and responding to. Could you, to begin with, take us through, give us a lay of the land of what's happening?
Well, I think a lot of Israelis feel extremely conflicted about what the next step should be in prosecuting the war, and also what the future is going to look like going forward. As long as hostages remain in Gaza, many feel that the first priority should be to liberate them at any cost, whether that be a ceasefire with Hamas, whether that be trading Palestinian prisoners who've committed other terrorist acts, through further military operations to possibly rescue some of the hostages in captivity. But I think that continues to drive the conversation. But every day and week that goes by, that becomes apparent that less and less hostages are alive, and the chances of rescuing them through some kind of military operation becomes more and more slim. The question has to be not only will these precious souls return to Israel, but also what will the future of Gaza look like? Will it be one where Hamas can be entirely eliminated? I think Hamas as an idea will never be able to be destroyed, although a good amount of its, fighting battalions and material, rockets, tunnels, have been destroyed. But is that enough? Has the mission been accomplished? And certainly without continuing the operation in Rafah, the last bastion of Hamas, although as we see every time Israel leaves some part of Gaza, it seems that Hamas has been able to reconstitute itself in other cities. Will that be enough to create a sense of deterrence and restore Israel's national security? Yet at the same time, even if there was a solution to Gaza, and it's really unclear who can and will govern Gaza if and when the Israeli military is willing to leave, other than a very long and protracted Israeli occupation, which will be deadly to both Israelis and Palestinians. There's also other emerging threats. The north of Israel has been virtually uninhabitable since 10/7. There are 60,000 Israelis displaced from the southern communities along the border with Gaza, but there's another 60,000 Israelis displaced from the north of Israel, including, some very important commercial centers for agriculture as well as tourism that have been utterly decimated by, Hezbollah rockets and drone attacks for the last 6 months. And there are 60,000 people in the north who don't know if and when they can return to their homes either. And so there's obviously going to be some expansion of the military operation in the north so that this can be habitable to Israelis for the future. And if and when that may happen, perhaps in August, which is what the rumor mill has to say right now. Certainly, even if the war with Hamas will be over, it's very possible there could be a second front of the war in the north. Mostly, I think Israelis are really concerned about what the future looks like. Even if they win on the battlefield, it's very clear that Israel has lost a great deal in the information wars or in the war of, human empathy or public diplomacy. And that, I think, has the greatest bearing upon the future, because Israel is certainly facing a lot of threats on its borders, but it's facing, I would imagine, kind of an equal threat in college encampments and on the internet and in the changing valence of many governments as it comes to policy with Israel, whether that be providing arms or diplomatic relations or economic activity. And that will have dividends, that go far beyond what happens, in the next 6 months along Israel's borders. So I think I'll stop there, and maybe we can continue the conversation with that lay of the land.
Professor, you mentioned displaced people, and they're displaced because of these attacks, drone attacks, which we all saw in a sense live on our screens, but also Hezbollah attacks, which relatively fewer people know about. Correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that as the world, in a sense correctly, worries about all these displaced people among the Palestinians, there are also several Israeli families and Israeli people who are also displaced by attacks, by Hezbollah, by drone attacks that they are facing. And this is one constituency, at least it seems to me, that certainly I did not know about or didn't know enough about, and most people don't know enough about. So there are also thousands of Israeli families who are now displaced too. While we are worrying about the displaced families,
120,000 Israelis. That's a minimal count.
so 120,000 Israelis are also displaced. So while we are worrying about all the thousands of Palestinians who are displaced, there are also 120,000 Israelis who are displaced. You spoke about Hezbollah attacks. Talk to us a little bit about what's happening there exactly.
Sure. So first, let me just say a bit more, because it's not necessarily so apparent to the international community, but every hotel here in Jerusalem is currently filled with internally displaced families, either from the southern border or in Israel's northern communities, who have nowhere to live, and they're essentially living in hotels scattered across Israel. Now, I don't know that we should be more concerned about these Israeli internal refugees than Palestinian internal refugees. Certainly, the state of Israel has greater capacity to aid its own people. It has more resources. It has the ability to draw on philanthropy from abroad. It certainly has a longer arm of government, but there is a crisis going on. But the fact that Hamas also wants to keep its people in place as human shields, often deterring them from seeking safety, I think is a qualitative difference between the Israeli government's approach, which has been to evacuate these communities rather than to leave civilians at the mercy of what is in both cases essentially a military campaign going on. In the north, there really is a military escalation. There has been, since October 7th, there's been kind of tit for tat attacks cross border, which have been going on for years, but have certainly there was great fear after October 7th that Hezbollah would join the war with Hamas in earnest. That didn't develop, but things have really taken a escalatory turn, especially over the last month or two, where we either deliberately or by mistake, Hezbollah has sent rockets and drones over the border that have caused massive fires and have destroyed a very significant commercial complex in the city of Kiryat Shmona. Allegedly hit an Iron Dome battery over the last few days, and it's hard to see, and killed several members of a Druze community in the northern border region that had not evacuated. Though but there are dozens and dozens of cities, including the largest city in the north, Kiryat Shmona, as well as many other smaller communities. 60,000 Israelis from the north have been evacuated from the area, and really no no area safe of Haifa has really been free of regular rocket attacks, even within the zones that are below the red line. There have been, significant incursions. So the question is how, can this be deterred? Um, the common wisdom is that Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah do not want an a real escalation of the war. But as we can see, this is happening even perhaps against the will of some of Hezbollah's leadership, whether that's because of mistakes made, in the course of battle that, have heightened tensions, or perhaps misreading the strategy of Hezbollah, just as Israel misread the strategy of Hamas, which, they had believed, and in all intelligence estimates had seemed to suggest, do not want an escalation with Israel. So it's very unclear what's going to happen. I think many residents of northern communities are agitating for a much more aggressive approach because they don't see an ability to return to their homes unless this they were not willing to live under another 10 years of rocket fire to return to their homes. But it's very unclear how that could be achieved, whether that will be done only by Israeli air power and what what kind of damage and frankly, death of civilians could occur through wide-scale bombing. Whether boots would need to be put on the ground and the massive consequences of that, and also the regional implications of an escalation with the north, because Hezbollah is an Iranian-backed proxy, and it's very difficult to see how Iran would necessarily sit out of further escalation and would not want to intervene in some way. Only a few weeks ago, I was, hiding in the stairwell of my apartment, and over 1,000, rockets, including ballistic missiles, were sent from Iran in direction of Israel. I don't know if, Israeli civilians are going to want to live like that, and that could be the potential danger of a further escalation. But the issue with the north is just as serious, if actually, frankly, more serious, because Hezbollah has always been has much more sophisticated military capacity than Hamas. And what may happen in the next several months, I think, could be quite, severe for both Israel and for Lebanon.
How does Israel, do you think, sees the death of Raisi in this accident, is this chopper accident? Is there an assessment in Israel that some things, in a sense, might turn towards moderation, or, in fact, as many people are saying, not only will nothing change, things may actually turn for the worse?
Right. I think, first of all, I guess we should say that Israel does not appear to have had a role to play in this chopper accident, although
Right.
there's certainly been quite a lot of rumors to the effect that this was some kind of Israeli, military or intelligence operation, but it seems to have been some kind of mechanical failure, or if not that, something that doesn't have to do with Israel. Raisi was kind of supposed to be the handpicked successor. So I think the field is now open in Iran. I'm not an Iran expert, but you can see from those who have already declared their intentions to run in the elections that there is, a widening gamut of politicians who are interested in, in being involved here. I think Israel, frankly, feels that this was, neutral, just like many policies in Israel, regardless of whether there was, someone perceived to be more moderate or more hawkish, some of the policies would say the same. I think this continues to be felt in Iran. I think the bigger question is less about, who will replace Raisi, and more about, will the Iranian public continue to tolerate the stances of the regime, which has certainly in many cases been against the political desires of the public, certainly crippling to the economy and Iran's social standing. So I think it's maybe more, the death of Raisi perhaps opens up more of an internal question for Iran rather than one that strictly deals with Israel-Iranian relations.
Does Israel today believe that Iran is on the verge of declaring nuclear weapons?
I think Israel has never had very much faith in the JCPOA or any other, measures, the IAEA or other international organizations to deter Iranian nuclearization. So I'm not privy to Israel's, intelligence assessments, but and what will be declared publicly versus privately. But I don't think that any leader or member of the intelligence community in Israel had any doubt that Iran's intent was to nuclearize, and that it was only a matter of time before that was going to be possible. In fact, it may have already happened. We just, as individuals, don't know about it.
Talk to me a little bit about the operations in Rafah. Which direction do you think they're likely to take?
Well, I think the Biden administration is certainly putting a lot of pressure on Israel first to minimize civilian casualties, which I think should go without saying. There's obviously been some discrepancies between the Hamas accounting of the latest attack on a UN school and what the Israeli government is saying about what happened there. But there's no doubt that there are and continue to be mounting civilian casualties in Gaza, not just of Hamas fighters, but also women and children and others, other civilians that are caught in the crossfire. And there have been, even without trusting, the Hamas, Ministry of Health's estimates, there's certainly been thousands, if not tens of thousands of deaths in Gaza. And the Biden administration, both for its own cynical political reasons with the November elections coming up, but I think also, as a good assessment of the way to fight a just war, even if the Biden administration agrees, I think, with Israel's intent to, prosecute a war here, to limit civilian casualties is important. And I think that they'll try to continue to pressure Israel and Gaza over that, even perhaps restricting some forms of military aid in order to not give Israel the weapons to do large scale aerial bombing or to have more targeted operations. But I think it's really a question of what is going to be achieved in Rafah. The first goal, I think, and perhaps the most important one, the control of the Philadelphia corridor, where most of the tunnels are located under the Egyptian Gaza border, has been achieved. It's now a question of who's going to run the show there. And Egypt obviously has also profited financially as well as perhaps ideologically from material exchange there, and that will come to an end, and that has some implications. And Israel is very keen to make sure that doesn't return. What else Israel can achieve in Rafah, besides eliminating any more rockets and tunnels and killing as many Hamas leaders and perhaps rescuing hostages, I think is uncertain. And also, the minute Israel leaves Rafah, it seems that the situation will be repeated in the way it has been in other parts of Gaza, that you leave one place, Hamas re-emerges there. So I don't think there's going to be a total victory in Rafah, just as there will not be a total victory in Gaza. The question is, what is the exit strategy? And I think the most defining feature of this entire war was, kind of the military doctrine is you don't get in unless you know how to get out. And on October 8th, no one knew that. And Israel decided to go into Gaza anyway for, I think, very, just reasons. But it has not developed a strategy in the last 8 months about how to get out of Gaza as much as how to get out of Rafah, one corner of Gaza itself. That's really troubling.
For reasons like this, some believe that opinion against Netanyahu in Israel is turning. There are some other national leaders from the past in Israel who have gone on American television and claimed that, in a sense, Israel was trying to prop up Hamas. And this is a plan that has gone completely haywire. It should have never been tried. Other strategies should have been tried. And this is essentially a plan that has gone very badly haywire. Where do you stand on those arguments?
Well, one of the most recent polls showed that 72% of the Israeli population wants Netanyahu to go. On the other hand, there's also been a really interesting development that actually shows that Likud, in I think last week's poll, actually was going to do much better in elections than it had previously, which comes to show the same fundamental weakness of the Israeli system, which is that Netanyahu is an extremely polarizing figure, and most of Israel wants him to go. But there also hasn't been any other leaders who have truly stepped up and shown their capacity to leave, and especially those who are in the war cabinet, who've had, months of complaining, but have not taken the steps to collapse the war cabinet or trigger new elections, who have really stood up to Netanyahu's power. Interestingly enough, the only people who are really standing up to Netanyahu, whether it be lip service or real, are his most ultra-nationalist allies who don't want a ceasefire deal in Gaza and have said that they will leave the government and trigger elections if that goes forward. So the only people really willing to step up to Netanyahu are those who are coming from, his rightward flank rather than from, the center or the left. So that's very disappointing. But I think there's, widespread consensus that, a terrible, tragic error was made on October 7th, and essentially, to use the Americanism, the buck stops with the prime minister. There were intelligence failures, there were military failures, there were political failures, there was misreading of Hamas's intentions, but ultimately, the person who is most culpable for these mistakes and has to take responsibility for them is the prime minister, and he needs to go. I don't know quite when that will happen, but apparently Benny Gantz says that he will be leaving the war cabinet on Saturday night. If that happens, I think we will see some momentum towards new elections and the end of the Netanyahu regime. And certainly, even if and when Netanyahu goes, there's going to be some kind of very massive commission to study the failures of October 7th that I do hope will ultimately implicate Netanyahu amongst many other figures in this, colossal intelligence, military, and political failure.
Let me argue the other side then. Some people take the other position, which says that Israel was left with very few choices. Israel, in fact, is left with very few choices, that it's an illusion that the Palestinians also want a peaceful two-nation, situation. If that were true, and no less than Bill Clinton is on record having argued this, that he, in his own words, did his best to try and give the Palestinians a state of their own and a situation for peaceful coexistence, but the Palestinians rejected all of this. In fact, as some would argue, in 2005, Israel did make an endeavor to completely cut back and, move all their, forces away from Palestinian territories. In fact, even Israeli graves were moved from Palestinian territories. The first thing that Hamas did, in fact, the first thing that happened in Palestinian territories after that is Hamas was elected by the Palestinian people, which immediately proceeded to start bombing or preparing to bomb Israel, kill people, start border attacks, even destroy the greenhouses that Israel had built in the Palestinian territories for food supplies. Now, if this is the truth, many would argue, how can anyone or any Israeli leader be blamed when they're fighting, in a sense, with their hands tied behind their back? They have no choice.
I would say two things about this. First, I think it's pretty clear that even if Netanyahu was to no longer be prime minister and some of his most likely replacements, Benny Gantz or Yoav Gallant, both esteemed generals, I don't think the prosecution of the war would look very different, nor would the reconstruction of Gaza necessarily look very different because of some of the realities that you are alluding to. There's also been a, perhaps misleading because there, it may look different in a few months, but, very poignant poll that Khalil Shakaki did of Palestinians in March 2024, which showed that 70 or 71% of Palestinians, both in the Gaza and the West Bank, essentially felt that October 7th was a good policy. And the Israeli public, whether or not they already had profound suspicions about the ability to live in peace and security with their neighbors, look at this poll and think to themselves, this is the end of the two-state solution. 70% of this population does not want to live side by side in peace and security. In fact, approved of 10-7 and may want another 10-7 or an endless 10-7 to happen here. So I think there is a lot of deep suspicion about what the future is going to look like. There's also many disturbing details emerging from Gaza about how deeply Hamas is embedded in the population. It's not that Hamas is entirely separate from innocent Gazan civilians. They are people's fathers and brothers and husbands and family members and friends. And, all of the details that have emerged about hostages being kept in hospitals and schools and in private family homes and tunnels underneath children's beds and, weaponry in people's refrigerators. I think that is deeply scarring to the Israeli public, even as the Israeli public itself has become more and more right wing, less and less inclined to accept a two-state solution for itself, more and more aggressively expanding in the West Bank, committing acts of settler terrorism that have not been deterred by this government. But yet, I think there's a qualitative difference between some of those characteristics and what Israelis are finding out from this Gaza operation that I think is extremely traumatizing for them to think that, their children were kept in a private family home of someone in Gaza, and held hostage there for months, I think does scar the Israeli public and makes it increasingly difficult, even though we have to try to remember that not all Palestinians are Hamas, and that many want a life without Hamas ruling their lives as much as with Israel. That it is very scarring to the Israeli public and it becomes more and more difficult for them to look at the Palestinian question in a way that has a promising future for the two-state solution, at least, if not, sort of a perpetual war.
Let me ask you a direct question then, Professor. Do you personally believe, as an academic living in Israel, do you believe that a two-state solution is ever going to be possible?
Probably not in my lifetime. It's going to take, a generation, I would think, for both Israelis and Palestinians to think about wanting to come back to a diplomatic table, and also to kind of cultivate kind of leadership that would be able to bring both populations to a place where they could see that happening once again. In the meantime, I also feel that fundamentally, the attitude towards a two-state solution has been changing for years, and not obviously that's accelerated since 10/7, but only minorities on both sides of the public prior to 10/7 were still interested in a two-state solution. Both were looking at their own version of a one-state solution, and I don't see there being consensus about that, or consensus about a two-state solution. So I don't know what I'm going to see in my lifetime other than kind of a stalemate. And it will also depend greatly not only about what happens here on the ground, but also the attitudes of the international community. It seems very clear that the Biden administration and other governments want to impose some kind of two-state solution now, this year even. And I don't think that anyone on the ground is going to be able to see that as a, not only as an interim idea, but as a durable and just peace. And that's the goal we're trying to get to. We can fault the Oslo process for never getting us there. It was supposed to be, 5 years to a final status agreement, and that never happened. And we could criticize that harshly, but I don't know that, now is the time to try and impose that kind of solution on the ground. Even though I believe that the international community will want to do so, and we're pressing that strongly.
Let's talk a little bit about the international community, Professor, as we come towards the end of our conversation. Like you said, the international community seems to want a desperate solution now, almost today, if possible. But this has been tried in other parts of the world. The international community, so to speak, at that time wanted an immediate solution in India and Pakistan. And look where that led. Coming from India, I'm only too cognizant of what happens when international communities want a solution today and now. But having said that, the international opinion about Israel also has dramatically gone through swings after October 7. There was a unison of great grief and anger after the dastardly attack happened on Israel. But ever since then, immediately there seemed to be a different kind of conversation. Now that conversation has reached a crescendo with all these protests at universities. It almost seems like that, in a sense, Israel is losing the narrative battle. Why is Israel losing the narrative battle? What can it do about this? Or is it a situation where perhaps the narrative battle has gone so far on the other side, so to speak, that it's way too skewed to be changed, at least in the near future? What do you think?
So first, I think that we should be learning from history and also be recognizing that Israel-Palestine emerges out of the same circumstances of many other countries at the end of World War II, the end of British colonial rule. India-Pakistan is a terrific example of this. A conflict between two nations, one that involved population transfers. Really, difficult and continuing sense of grievance and even warfare over parts of territory. And we need to, I think about Israel-Palestine in comparative perspective and think about what we can learn from other cases around the world. But it's true that I think Israel has lost the narrative battle in a way that's different maybe from India or Pakistan losing international support, partially because Israel is the one and only state of the Jews. And this is part of a larger trajectory of Jewish history as much as global history or history of decolonization or new colonizations or all kinds of other possible trends, and that has something to do with it. I am just shocked and frankly often disgusted by the kind of moral inversion that's gone on here, and some of the claims that have been alleged against Israel, which are obviously particularly hurtful in light of Jewish history. The claim of genocide or blood libels or other kinds of tropes that in the history of the Jewish people, this is not the first time, and it has been heard before. And ultimately, the changing tenor of the changing tenor of the international community. We're hearing, students on encampment saying, basically Israel should be wiped off the map, and it's, time for kind of final solution to Israel-Palestine. And I think, ears ring when we with that kind of language. For anyone who's a student of Jewish history as much as the history of modern Israel or the history of modern Palestine. So that's deeply troubling. I Israel has lost the narrative war for a variety of reasons. Some of it has to do with Israel's actions, but some of it has to do with Israel's poor leadership and the current government that is prosecuting this war. Israel, regardless of has terrible public diplomacy and does not effectively project its soft power in that way. But of course, that kind of state public diplomacy can only go so far when it comes to actions. You have to follow, you can only explain your actions so well. So some of it, has to do with deed, but I think a lot of it also has to do with rhetoric and the way that Israel is now part of a larger matrix of identity politics and the question of powerful and powerless, the victims and the victimizers. It has to do, particularly in the United States, with domestic questions about white supremacy and how Israel has been linked into this, this vast white colonial power network, whether or not that truly and accurately reflects the history of the Jewish people, the history of Israel, which today is a minority majority state, has more Mizrahi and Ethiopian and we could say brown Jews than it does Ashkenazi quote unquote white Jews, although I wouldn't necessarily equate Ashkenazi with white. So it's been part of this much larger dynamic where Israel is really only a symbolic player here, but it fits, it fits quite nicely for those who are very wedded to this dogma into a larger paradigm without a lot of, for those who don't want to do a lot of critical thinking about the true history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or about Jewish history or global history, this just slots in nicely to a larger worldview that many have today, and so it becomes kind of a convenient trope and one that's easily digestible because it's part of a larger, it's part of a larger global discussion, and Israel is fitting well into that, and it's very difficult, I think, to challenge the larger conversation based on myths and facts of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. People are simply not interested really in the reality or history or ideas that may challenge prevailing paradigms about settler colonialism, state violence, white supremacy, and otherwise. So we're in a very challenging situation where the conversation isn't really even about Israel when it's about Israel. And I see very few options to really be able to have a conversation or a corrective to this conversation without there being a real willingness to think critically and restore, I think, some of the larger, I guess, moral value propositions that are being lost in this conversation, because you can't even have a conversation about Israel unless you're willing to have a spirit of critical thinking, of dialogue, of engagement, of of being willing to challenge your own positionality, and that's just something that isn't really part of a lot of what's happening in the cultural conversation right now. So that leaves Israel, I think, extremely betwixt and between in this war of narratives at the moment.
My final question then, Professor, you very neatly summed up the crisis that Israel faces on many fronts, including the narrative front. Because you're an academic, talk to us a little bit about what Israel can do to fight this narrative. A lot of people don't know, including in India and other parts of the world, that the Jewish people, for instance, were spread across the Middle East. Many of these countries today have zero Jews, and no one, without lying, can ever, hand on heart, answer correctly what happened to all these Jews. Where did they go? How did they disappear? All of those questions which had begun to be raised internationally have all disappeared, in a sense, after this conflict. What can Israel do to put its point of view forward without, of course, diminishing the real crisis that the war in Gaza faces, or really the war in Gaza really forces on human lives on both sides?
Well, first, I think is where is your final point, is I think that one of the most important tools that we can teach anybody today is not about history or politics. It's about empathy and values. I think that's where the conversation has to begin. It's just on kind of the basic level of historical empathy of what would you do if you're standing in these other people's shoes, and how can we look at the history of this conflict from multiple dimensions, not only intellectually, but I think also on some level kind of more emotionally and morally. I think that's a very important starting point, because you really can't get anywhere with a conversation about the history of the conflict without being able to take different perspectives and also to connect to the emotional dilemmas that are embedded in this larger history. But I think Israel and more broadly, people who are interested in this part of the world can't ignore the prevailing paradigms of our contemporary conversation. Settler colonialism, state violence, patriarchy, white supremacy. So we need to engage with those conversations, but we also need to put forward histories that are, consonant with a more nuanced and critical understanding of what that means. Was Israel a settler colonial state? Yes, on some level, it emerged out of European national ideas in the 19th century. But look at Israel today. Can we make a fair argument that Israel is only, another example of white colonial supremacy? I think we'd have difficulty mapping that accurately. So I think we need to engage with these debates, but also, put some, inject more complexity, more nuance, more dialogue, and more engagement into them. I guess the last thing I guess I would hope for is that I hope there'll be a day when, dialogue is possible again. One of the most deeply troubling phenomena I see, particularly online, but I think it's also increasingly happening between individuals. I know for myself in terms of the academic boycott of Israel, which is just anti-normalization, boycotts, and unwillingness to engage, or even considering civility itself to be under attack as a tool of occupation or a tool of oppression. If we can't talk to each other, we can't have reasonable dialogue, we can't meet each other where we are, understand other people's cultures, languages, histories, religions, needs, wants, values, we are never going to get to anything other than a state of perpetual warfare. So if we don't engage, and that seems to be the trend, is towards disengagement, anti-normalization, boycott, I think we're going to be in really big trouble. Or at very least, the state of Israel is going to be in very big trouble, because the survival of the state of Israel, as much as the future state of Palestine, is about is about a state up here and here. It's about a state of being able to engage as much as it is, any plan in a drawer that a diplomat has on paper about how to divide Jerusalem, or how to create a two-state solution by drawing a line in the sand of the map. So that's what I'm really, really worried about. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to your audiences as one, form of engagement, and I hope there will be more of that rather than less, in the future.
Dr. Sara Hirschhorn, thanks very much for explaining this point in history, as it were, with such lucidity, care, and empathy to us. I wish you and everybody in Israel the very best. May all peoples live in peace and harmony and find the empathy that you spoke about. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to speak with you.